Thank you. This is, I believe, the 5th book event we've hosted for Alexandra Hudson, Young Voices has. Although she has gotten dozens and dozens of book events across the country and also in Europe. And in most of these events, I've been in conversation with Alexandra, but I was very happy to be usurped tonight by a much more prestigious voice, Virginia Postrel. So we are very fortunate to have Virginia, a really acclaimed author, former editor-in-chief of Reason magazine in the 90s, and an author of a lot of foundational books. My personal favorite, The Future and Its Enemies, but also recently The Fabric of Civilization. She really needs no introduction, so we're so happy to have Virginia. And joining us, of course, in conversation will be Alexandra Hudson, who is the author of The Soul of Civility. And afterwards, we have complimentary copies for you to take home, and Alexandra can sign. So I will invite them over to take over for the conversation. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming out. And so there's a lot in this book, and we'll only touch on some of the things, and some of the things I'm going to try to be more provocative, and other things I'm just going to try to let you do your spiel. But let's start with the basics. What is civility, and how is the way you use civility as a term different from what a lot of people think of when they hear the term civility?
Writing a book on civility is a great challenge, but also an opportunity. It's a topic that everyone thinks they know and they have an opinion on. And I argue that actually no one really fully appreciates what true civility actually is. I argue that civility is the art of human flourishing. It's the bare minimum of respect that we are owed and owe to others by virtue of our shared dignity, our personhood, our equal moral worth as human beings. And civility, most importantly perhaps, is different from mere politeness. Civility is not so this is a core argument in my book, the difference between civility and politeness. I argue that politeness is etiquette, it's manners, it's technique, it's the external stuff, it's mores, whereas civility is internal. It's a disposition of the heart. It's a way of seeing others as our moral equals, worthy of a bare minimum of respect just by virtue of our shared moral status as members of the human community. And that crucially, sometimes actually respecting someone, actually loving someone well, requires being impolite. It requires having an uncomfortable conversation, telling a hard truth, risking offending someone, engaging in robust debate. So Samuel Johnson, the author of the first English dictionary in 1755, he defined civility in terms of politeness, politeness in terms of civility. We've actually been doing it ever since. Even today, we hear people and voices that want more civility and politeness in public life. We just need to recover these lost virtues, and we'll have more harmony and comity in our public life. And there's another contingent that says, no, we need less civility and politeness in public life. They're the tools of the patriarchy, people in positions of power, white supremacists, and we need to burn it all down. We need less civility and politeness in public life in order to achieve greater justice and equity in our world. And I argue that both these groups, both these voices, actually conflate these ideas. They conflate civility and politeness when they should be disambiguated. I love etymology. The story of our language, the origin of our words, is throughout my book, and the etymologies of these words, civility and politeness, supports this distinction I make. The Latin root of our word politeness is polliere, which means to smooth or to polish, and that's what politeness does. It's superficial, it's external, it polishes over difference, as opposed to giving us the tools to grapple with difference head on. Whereas the etymology of our word civility is civitas, which is the Latin root of our word for citizenship, civilization, city, and the citizen. And that is what civility is. It's the conduct, the habits, the disposition befitting a citizen in the city, which, again, especially in a democracy like our own, demands truth-telling. It demands debate the life, which can risk offending people. It's about more than politeness. So I argue throughout the book that too often we're content with people, doing and saying the right things. We're content. We too often settle for mere politeness, and we should instead aim for true civility instead of actually respecting others, even risking offending them.
So to put a little meat on the bones of that, I was interested in your acknowledgments, which are very exemplify a lot of your ideas. But in your acknowledgments, you thank Sherry Turkle for putting civility into practice by telling me hard truths about where the book required improvement. Now, I don't know how comfortable you are going into detail.
I'm happy to.
But
yeah.
I would be interested in, what do you mean when you say the civility requires telling hard truths, and what advice, tell us the story.
Yeah. So a few things. Sherry is an amazing philosopher of, she's probably the foremost thinker on community in a digital and technological age. And she's been a tech skeptic. It's funny, she's at MIT. Yeah. She's been there for decades.
Yeah.
But she is tech skeptic. She's kind of a minority at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, being skeptical of technology. And her next book is on how AI is changing us as human beings. It's really fascinating. So I love her work, and she's been a good friend and mentor. So she read my manuscript in a day. And she was ready to talk about it the day after I sent it to her. And most people I sent my manuscript to, I expected to never hear from them again. It was long. It was and she was ready to talk about it. And she was there were moments of brilliance in this book, and moments of incredible self-indulgence, and way too much. You talk way too much about yourself. Take yourself out of it. And you talk too much about your mother. And so, and she also. It's interesting. So part of my story that I'm happy to get into, I had a role at the United States Department of Education. I was, with the Trump administration. And I just mentioned, that's not an important part of my story. My story is about the deep divisions I experienced in government at an interpersonal level that were kind of a microcosm of the deep divisions at a national and international level. And I just mentioned offhandedly that I was with Secretary DeVos in one sentence in my introduction. And she said, Lexi, I loved your book, and on the whole net, despite these shortcomings that you can fix. And she said, I vomited in my mouth, when I saw the mention of who you worked for, and I didn't want to read the rest of it. And I was wow, that's helpful, really helpful feedback that, she's of a different political persuasion. We agree on many things, we disagree on some things, and, that was just not an important part of my story, and I was glad to take that out because it was non-essential, and I didn't want to unnecessarily alienate potential readers who could, find value in the book. And so Sherry was one of many great readers I had early on.
So as editing, I would say that's very good advice. And I want to talk about audience in a minute, but in terms of civility, however, to say of Betsy DeVos, it makes me want to vomit in my mouth. I don't care what she says, but the sentiment behind that is not let's say it's not a generous sentiment. It's not saying, look, I disagree with Betsy DeVos on 10 million different things, but I understand she, like me, wants to improve education. She's just mistaken about how this would work, or she has some core values that are different from mine. It's a very ungenerous way. And when you're talking about sort of how people think about people across the political spectrum, I think that lack of generosity, now that's Virginia, her yakety yak, but anyway, is a big part of it. And so I'm wondering, how can your ideas address that concern? There are people who are, deeply offended by people on the other side of the political spectrum, or they think they're so, even if they're well-intended, their ideas are so bad that de facto they're evil. You know, how are people supposed to behave in those situations?
Well, I think what was helpful about Sherry sharing her reaction is that it was like a visceral reaction.
Yeah,
It
I mean,
was
it's
like,
very good editing advice. I don't fault it for that.
And it helps clarify for me. Like, I only know, I'm honest about my priors. I call it owning my priors in my introduction. Like, I talk about my Christian faith. That's a fundamental part of my philosophical orientation. I talk about how I'm open about my classical liberalism, and I think it's just intellectually honest to let readers know where I'm coming from. But this is why I sought out feedback from people that I deeply disagree with. Like, I didn't want anything in there to be unnecessarily triggering or off-putting. Like, things that aren't even like important. Even just some of the language I use, it was helpful that she caught on. She's like, but it's funny that what the chapter that Sherry loved most in my book was my chapter on hospitality. And I
have a lot of more to talk about.
Yeah, and I talk about how hospitality is a high and noble expression of civility. And it's not just about having dinner parties, and it's certainly not just about, when people get a degree in hospitality today, they're getting a degree in like hotel management. And what I do in my book is show that it's a much deeper, richer, more vibrant tradition about showing kindness to the stranger, welcoming the outsider and making them an insider, a stranger into a friend. And that can be practical. It can literally be about sharing a meal with someone. It can also be intellectual as well, like just having space in your life and in your mind to entertain ideas and even people that live lives and think differently than you. So I do think that her feedback was helpful, because I think it's emblematic of a lot of people. They're just like their gut instinct, their visceral reaction. But at the same time, she did see a lot of value in this book, but also this particular chapter that celebrates intellectual diversity and just diversity of opinion coming together across difference as well.
I want to talk about. Tell us who the audience is. I mean, obviously, as an author, I hate this question. Who is your audience? My audience is anybody who'll buy the damn book, I'd preferably read it, but definitely buy it. And obviously, you want as many people to read it as possible. But when one is writing a book, you kind of have a picture of the type of reader. Who are you picturing? Who's your ideal audience, or who's the audience you want to reach?
It's really an interesting question. I wanted to write the kind of book that I like to read, and I like books like yours. What I think I love about your writing, one thing I loved about specifically the Fabric of Civilization is you treat a very specific subject matter in its entirety, like doing justice to a really interesting kind of niche. And I mean, I'm curious, did you mean for your book to be written and be a bestseller in knitting communities across the world? That's, was that your ideas?
That wasn't what inspired the book, but I did do some very specific marketing.
There you go. Yeah.
Especially, because, anyway. Yeah.
So a big part of my audience was what has been called the exhausted majority. There's this great research institute called, what is it called? The research report was called Hidden Common Ground, but I think they're called More in Common, right? And they had this paper that showed actually even though the fringe, the extremists kind of dominate our public life, most Americans, 80-85%, are just exhausted with toxicity, and they just want to live their lives in peace and don't want the culture wars to be at the forefront of their psyche and their conversations and their every facet of every interaction with every other person. And that was so I had in mind a lot of people in this room, people who are from the Brave Angels community and in the depolarization space, people who are hungry to be a part of the solution and hungry for a set of tools and a book, a manifesto for why it's so important to be part of rehumanizing our public life and our public discourse when it is so dehumanizing and dehumanized.
Yeah, so you're right. It doesn't matter how vigorously we deny or ignore it. At some foundational level of our soul is disquieted when we debase our humanity through viciousness toward our fellow persons. Now, I would love to believe that. I mean, I think it's true on a sort of metaphysical level, but it seems like there's a whole lot of people, and from I was going to say all across the political spectrum. Maybe they're at the ends, but definitely there's plenty on the right and plenty on the left who get great pleasure from viciousness. And, this is what Twitter is all about. And not just the new Elon Twitter, the old Twitter too. And they don't care much if it debases their humanity. They don't feel like that. They feel like they're being strong and proud and fighting for the right. I mean that, or it could be the left, but fighting for the virtue, what's your evidence that people care about this, and how do you change my pessimistic view of the world? I have an optimistic long-term view, but a pessimistic short-term view.
So the title of my book is The Soul of Civility, and the word soul is important. That's actually homage to a really important discussion in Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. When I was in government, and we haven't even gotten to my story, but I lived and worked through a very toxic season of government. It was 2017, 2018. I went in bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, couldn't wait to make the world a better place, or at least a little bit of a better place. And I was just deeply disillusioned and discouraged by what I experienced and observed there. And didn't feel like I was being part of the solution in government, wanted to be, and left to write this book. But a really formative experience while I was in government was a retreat I was invited to with the Aspen Institute. And we went to Wye River, Maryland, that just about an hour outside of DC on the Eastern Shore. And there were a bunch of us, maybe 20 of us, across the political spectrum, from across the administrative agency, from Congress, from nonprofits, talking about the role of civility in public life. Something that was really at the forefront of my mind as I was living in this era and environment of anti-human flourishing, just deeply unhappy. And I had read Dr. King's letter before, but it was a close rereading in this environment that was really, really clarifying for me. Dr. King in his letter makes a really important statement about segregation. He says that segregation doesn't just hurt the segregated; it hurts the segregator as well. Of course, it hurts the segregated. It gives them a false sense of inferiority, which is wrong. But it also deforms, it debases the soul of the segregator as well. It hurts both parties. And I realized that the same is true about civility and incivility, that we hear a lot. There's as you rightly acknowledge, a tenor of apocalypticism that defines our public life, our public discourse right now. We hear people, our public leaders, people on social media saying we have to be willing to do whatever it takes to win, to achieve our vision of the good, to win this election, to pass this law, whatever it is, even if it means dehumanizing people along the way. And I realized that that sort of instrumentalization of the other, that willingness to engage in violence and apocalyptic rhetoric and viciousness, that of course dehumanizes and debases the other, but people insufficiently appreciate the way that hurts our own soul too, those that engage in that sort of rhetoric. And the same is true, the inverse is true of incivility. Just as incivility hurts both parties, civility is mutually ennobling. Acts of charity, grace, compassion, kindness, hospitality, it humanizes both parties. It makes us more fully human and more humane. And Dr. King, he was a student of what I call the great conversation, this iterative dialogue across time and place about foundational questions. What does it mean to be human? What is the best way to live? Origin, purpose, and destiny. And he was very much in dialogue with people like Socrates and Boethius, who said similar things. Like Socrates said that virtue is health of the soul. And a virtuous soul is a just soul that seeks justice and acts with justice with those around them. Whereas an unjust soul, a vicious soul, is a sick soul. And a sick soul acts with injustice towards those around them. And an unjust soul is a sick soul, and that's its own punishment. That's its own, even if they don't recognize that they are sick, that is its own punishment. So people who act with injustice, they don't deserve our disdain, our viciousness. They deserve our deep compassion, that they are dying, they are sick, they are suffering, and they don't even realize it. But that those that act with virtue and with justice towards others, that is a symptom of a just soul. That is a healthy soul. That is its own reward. And so this is the dialogue and the discourse that Dr. King was very immersed by and influenced by.
So you have this idea of unoffendability, which you call the superpower of the 21st century. What is unoffendability?
I learned about unoffendability from my grandmother, who is like just like social Teflon. She was someone who went into every human interaction just with an eagerness to maximize it and really just see and know people in the fullness of who they were. And she just loved people. Like, she just was passionate about the human social project. And that deeply perplexed many people. You know, people would be like, why was this woman talking to me? What does she want from me? You know, very cynical. And they would brush her off. They would ignore her. They might be rude to her in response. And she was excellent at not letting that bother her. She would tell herself a story of exoneration, a story that exonerated them. I think today it's really easy when we encounter a rude, brusque, you know, distasteful person, we tell a story of condemnation. That's a bad person. That right. Is like, you know, but she was excellent at saying, you know, this is more about them and where they're at in life, what they're going through. Maybe they have a diagnosis, maybe they have a sick child, maybe they just lost their job, than about me. And I'm not going to react in in kind to make their life a little harder. Like, they're already clearly very unhappy. They're hurting. They're wounded. That's why they're lashing out at me, or that's why they're they're brusque. And she was impossible to offend. You couldn't, you know, if you did your darndest, you could not. She was unflappable. And I think today and Marcus Aurelius is a great line on this. He said that, you know, just remember that you always, you know, that our ability to take offense or not take offense lies with us. You know, that we have agency over that. My grandmother, you know, had never read Marcus Aurelius, but she definitely embodied that because she, that was just how she chose to live her life.
Now, what if somebody would say, well, it's easy for her to be unoffended because whether or not she gets offended has no particular social repercussions, but, you know, I'm a member of this disadvantaged group or, you know, this oppressed group or whatever, and I personally might be able to suck it up, but if I don't say anything, this kind of offensive behavior is going to be continued and be rewarded. I mean, you know, what is your answer to that? I mean, I'm very good at not being offended. I mean, I get offended, but it's, you know, I'm too cocky, but you know, I'm also in a position where it doesn't really make a big difference in my life if somebody is mean to me. Although, let me tell you about the New York Times book review. No, anyway, so my question is, you know, what if somebody says, I understand that argument, and as a personal matter, that's very good psychological advice. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I think many psychologists would exactly say that. There's this idea of the fundamental attribution error, right, where you attribute it to, you know, person character as opposed to the circumstances. But what about things that have more, you know, greater social ramifications? Because a lot of people calling out things are because they believe that it's not just them, it's a whole social category that's being offended.
You know, and this is why my grandmother, she's such an important role model to me and a role model for our times. It's like, I am that person that feels the need to, like, stand up to the tyranny of TSA, because who else are they bullying? You know, like, I feel like I have like a chip on my shoulder. I feel like, you know, I have to stand up for these injustices because who else is going to do it? You know, and my grandmother, you know, she's such a good example to me of just focusing on things that really matter in life. She had great psychological health, and she was a very, like, deeply fulfilled and happy person. And as is my mother after her. They just have this like, you know, wellspring, this undercurrent of, like, joy that just pervades. And I'm much more cynical, and I'm much more, you know, willing to fight or speak up, because I feel like, you know, who else is going to do it if not me? And, you know, even my husband is a good corrective to me in this way as well.
So we've talked a little bit about hospitality, but I want to loop back to it. You write, hospitality is a noble expression of civility. Civility and hospitality go hand in hand. The more one cultivates the disposition of civility, the more hospitable one becomes. The more one practices hospitality, the more one appreciates the beauty and dignity of the human person, and the more civil one becomes to all they meet. Hospitality, anyway, it goes on. It's just like, sorry, I have 2 long quotes. I want you to talk a little bit about how you're defining hospitality, why it's important, but you also talk about having a dark side. And what is that dark side? And I have another idea of a dark side. Yeah.
So to start my chapter on hospitality, I tell the story of Eumaeus. Eumaeus was a slave in ancient Greece. He was someone who didn't have much in the way of personal autonomy or power or material possessions. And yet, one day, when Eumaeus encountered someone who seemed to have even less in the way than he did of material possessions and provisions than he did, he invited him to his home, and he said, let me clothe you, let me bathe you, let me feed you. And only after he had given him a place to stay, welcomed him to his home, fed him, only after he'd done all those things, he said, now tell me your story. And imagine his surprise when he realized that this stranger that he had invited into his home was his long-lost master and friend, Odysseus, who had been lost at sea for a decade after the Trojan War. And Odysseus is, of course, thrilled. The entire Odyssey is about hospitality. The theme of Xenia, basically our duties to the stranger, and the guest-host relationship is like the define, and the manners associated, the norms and expectations of guest-host relations is like the core theme of the Odyssey. And so I use that as kind of like a jumping off point to explore this topic. And what's amazing is though that there's cultural resonance of this theme of like showing kindness to the stranger, and this motif of strangers as gods in disguise. Like you never, and the stranger as God. Like that's across history and culture, and in ancient Sanskrit myth and tradition, and in Hebrew Bible, like that you just never know who you might be showing hospitality to. And even if it's no one who will ever repay you, it's not a God who can reward you. You do it because you never know if you or someone you love might one day find yourself in need. It was sort of this ethos of generalized reciprocity. You just did it because you did it. It was just like, and it's fascinating to me that we find this sort of this high ethical standard across history and culture.
So ethics of hospitality are, as you say, very common around the world and throughout history. But they are also tend to be associated with cultures that are often very violent, very oppressive. And I actually had this interesting experience, Afghans, very hospitable people, unless you get on their bad side, I have a friend in the Hand Weaving Guild. This happened because of that book, not the other way around. Anyway, and we had a lecture one time from this woman who's in the guild about her wonderful textile tour of Uzbekistan. And one of the things she talked about was how incredibly hospitable the Uzbeks were, and how they, opened their homes, and they had food, and, it was really wonderful. Okay, then a few months later, I'm reading this Substack by an economist called Alice Evans, who is writing a global book about looking at the status of women, the relationship between economic development and the decline or non-decline of patriarchy. It's not as simple as you think around the world. And one of the things that she pointed out is she did field work in Uzbekistan. And again, just like my friend in the Hand Weaving Guild, Uzbeks, super nice, super hospitable, wonderful food, and there's a whole exchange of gifts and stuff. But if they're middle class, they would have like a separate room that's just for hosting guests. But all of that is done on the back of the wife. The wife spends enormous amounts of time cooking and cleaning so that she can invite anybody in. And her one goal in life is that she'll marry her son off, and she'll get a daughter-in-law so she can use the daughter-in-law to do all the work. And I hadn't thought of that. I mean, I thought hospitality, I'm not very hospitable, but, it's good to be hospitable. It's a virtue. But I hadn't thought about, but in order to do that, somebody has to do all that work. And it's one thing if you have servants, but, not everybody does. or if you could pay caterers or whatever. So it's a trade-off. It's an interesting puzzle to me about how you combine that kind of openness, because as everything in life, there are trade-offs. If you're going to be doing lots and lots of hospitality, you're not going to be doing something else, studying or working or, you know, playing tennis, whatever it is. So I'm curious about
The dark side of
the
hospitality.
dark side of hospitality, but not just the dark side of hospitality. You know, maybe, I mean, flourishing has a lot of components, and maybe this is, you know, but you have this more generalized theoretical idea of hospitality, and not just inviting people to come in your house and eat.
Well, what I think is interesting is that we live in an age where, you know, we're really seduced and quick to accept stories of decline. Like, we like to think that, we like to tell you stories that, oh my gosh, things are so divided, things are so bad. But which is why I kind of appeal to history throughout my book, and you know, I look at other areas of incivility and civility that that can teach us now. But in Diderot and d'Alembert's Encyclopédie, this like crowning achievement of the French Enlightenment, one of the authors explores hospitality. In the section on hospitality, he says, you know, we as French people and as a European society, we're just not as hospitable anymore as we used to be. And he makes a really interesting observation about hospitality. He said, you know, he says that this is like in the 1700s, right? Like, he's like, you know, he says thousands of years ago, people didn't travel. You know, but we're far more mobile now, he says, in the 1700s. And he says we have means of exchange of currency, we have hotels, we have inns, and all these things have made us less hospitable today, because we have these developments, we're more mobile. And I mean, that's even more true today.
Well,
we have credit cards, we have
those
hotels.
strong mores of hospitality,
Yeah.
in this very specific sense of bringing people into your home, are very much associated with significantly poorer, often kind of clan. I mean, yes, it's about welcoming the stranger, but the idea is like, you don't live in a society of strangers. You live in a society of everybody you know, and then along comes a stranger, and how
We
do you
depend
deal with
on
them?
people less today than like thousands of years ago. Like, if a stranger comes to your doorstep and doesn't have anywhere else to go, like, you either take him in and feed him, or he dies.
I live in West LA. There's a lot of strangers.
But today, someone shows up at your door, you say, you know, there's a social service down the street that I'm sure will take care of. We don't do that anymore. That is true, but I also tell lots of stories of contemporary hospitality, the portioning revolution.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, talk about the portioning revolution. What is that? Because I doubt, unless they've read your book, a lot of people probably don't know what that is.
So, had a very toxic experience in Washington and government. I survived a year. One day I realized I've had enough. It was actually 2 subsequent weekends. It was the one at the Aspen Institute, and then my very first Liberty Fund that I went to. It was actually, I was at the U.S. Department of Education, and it was on the role of the state in education.
For those of you who don't know what this is she's talking about, which is probably at least half of you, probably 60, 90% of it, Liberty Fund is an organization in Indianapolis, where you live, that runs, among other things, runs a lot of conferences where they bring together people from different fields around a theme, around 15 people. You have assigned readings before you come, and you spend 2.5 days like talking about the reading. There's no output, there's no, I mean, they're internal reports, but it's just to have a conversation. And it's a wonderful thing. And
so I went into this Liberty Fund, you know, in the belly of the beast, ready to argue, like, yes, there is at least a small role for the state in education. And by the end of it, I was like, the state should not be in education. What am I doing here? I need to leave. And so I came home from work one day and said to my husband, I am done with DC. I'm done with government. Let's move to Indiana. And he says to me, okay, sounds good. We'll move to Indiana. No take-backs, and a few months later we moved out there, and it's been almost 6 years.
So is either of you from Indiana?
He's from tiny little town in northeast Indiana. And so we moved there a few months later, and one of my first friends there Her name is Joanna Taft. She came up to me after church one day and she said, "Hi, I'm Joanna. Would you like to porch with us sometime?" And I never heard the word porch used as a verb before, but I was curious, and we didn't know many people in town. And so we went to her home that afternoon, and I realized that from her great big front veranda of her turn-of-the-century home, she was staging a quiet revolution of hospitality, of civility, and against our divided, our alienated, our broken, our lonely status quo. She had curated people on her front porch that day, people across politics, across race, across geography. A core argument in my book is that there's a lot that is the same about this problem that hasn't changed. It's a part of the human condition that we all share, that we're profoundly social but also have a competing need to meet our own needs that is in tension. But one thing that is different across in our current moment is the fact that it's very easy to just go through life and kind of curate our existence virtually and corporally in such a way that we don't really encounter people that we don't want to encounter. Even if, in the age of digital nomads and working from home, or even if we do go to the office, we go from our home to car and office and back again, and we have groceries delivered, and we have food delivered, and we don't really have to encounter people we don't want to encounter, which is all of which is so radical. What's so radical about?
So what happens on the porch?
On the porch that we, she had it wasn't a place to curate conversation across difference, where you talk about your position on this issue, and
right.
It was just a place to be seen and known and loved in the fullness of who we were as human beings. It was a place to rehumanize one another across these deep differences.
So what does that mean in action? Like, what do you do on the porch?
You drink Manhattans, and you have a charcuterie board, and it's not. We're very ends oriented.
So basically, I just want to know literally what you do. So basically, you hang out, eat, and talk.
That's right. That's right. And it's not a networking event. It's
Yeah.
not a place where you're like, okay, I'm going to leave with 5 new professional connections. It's a place that is like not inherently non-instrumental. It's just a place to be and just a place to pass the time. And this is where seeds of friendship and trust that is so direly lacking in our world today germinate and foster and grow. We are deeply skeptical. There's so many forces around us tell us to be dubious of the other, don't trust, fear the different, right? And this is a place to remind us that we have way more in common as human beings, as citizens in this great country, than that which differentiates us.
But you are all living in Indiana.
There
is an element of Midwestern nice to this.
But I will tell you, when I was a Novak Journalism Fellow, I traveled the country, and I've also been in 45 cities as part of this book tour in 5 countries, and I've seen people with and without porches doing the same thing.
Yeah.
They are creating with their lives and their homes a space, an oasis from the division. A friend hosted a book party in Miami. We were on his dock, overlooking the ocean. I was like, we're porching right now. Like, it's not about that. I've seen it at front stoops, front lawns, in people's dining rooms. People hold office hours in coffee shops. People know that this is just the time where you can come for conversation and community. That it's not about what you have or the architectural orientation of your home, although that does matter. I happen to talk about the metaphor of the porch, but it's about how you live your life and how you use what you do have to create community wherever you are and with whatever you have.
So this talk makes me think in various ways about the issue of social capital, which you raise. You don't use the term, but you write about the research that Harvard sociologist Abraham Jack has done about the difficulties that students from disadvantaged backgrounds have with the unwritten rules of college. And he wants to level the playing field by having colleges be more transparent and welcoming and clear, articulate the rules. For example, tell people what office hours are, and that you can go to them and get help, and that it won't hurt your grades, and like stuff that people know if they're from a background where their friends, relatives went to college, but people might not know. And so I would call those those specific things are in the university context, but these are differences in social capital. There are differences where people grow up in one milieu and they're in another milieu which has the potential to elevate them socially and economically. But even if they have all the skills, the intelligence, the talents, and the education, because this is different from human capital, they're at a disadvantage because they don't know the unwritten rules. And this is not etiquette. It's not etiquette, because etiquette is stuff that you can get a book. I mean, in fact, that's the whole 18th century etiquette. People started writing these down. So, this includes polish, but it's mostly about these unwritten norms. But you say, well, the better thing would be not to have rules. Is that theoretically possible? I mean, yeah, this is mine.
Yeah.
So
the key point that I love about Jack's work as a sociologist, he was at Harvard, I think he's left now, is that, for all the lip service that elite institutions give to diversity and equity and having equal opportunity, that they actually don't live their lives that way, in ways that promote equity. They still value things like, where do you holiday? Can you talk about fine wine? What clothes are you wearing? And this is what the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu called habitus. And habitus encompasses social norms, but it's also modes of consumption and tastes and preferences. It is manners, but it's about more than that. It's about lifestyle that is replicated in the home and in the homes of privileged people, and that it's not about you can talk about equity all day, but you're actually living your life in a way that is benefiting and preferencing people who kind of taste and experience life like you.
So if you're aware of that and you're not running an institution, you're just a person, what can you do to make it, to level that playing field more? I mean, you have this very impressive book tour, which is clearly a result of great social capital, great network, being able to travel. There's a lot of things that are great. How do you share that?
Well, we do this every day. We make these assumptions about others based on what Freud called the narcissism of small differences. People just have different tastes or preferences, but you like the color green, I like the color blue. I moralize that. Oh, Virginia likes green. She has bad taste. She's a bad person. People do that all the time. In ancient Greece, for example, the Greeks and the Macedons were ethnically Greek. They were the same people group. And yet the Greeks, they were, not the only culture to have done this, but they told these stories of superiority because of their cultural tastes and preferences. They cut their wine with salt water. The Macedons drank it straight. They ate lying down. The Macedons ate sitting up. And the Greeks said, we do it so much better. Those Macedons, they are barbarians. They are uncivilized. And they're the same people group, right? They're literally the same people group. But their mores, their manners, their habitus, they told themselves a story of superiority, and that it wasn't just different. They were morally inferior. They were intellectually, culturally, civilizationally inferior. And we do this every day in ways great and small without even realizing it. And so what I really like about Jack's point is that he's arguing, what I argue in my book is that we need to be less fixated on whether people do and say the right things. Are they complying to a T with the rules of etiquette? And we should just be more focused on, as Dr. King said, the content of someone's character, their capabilities, and often focusing on complying with these small rituals and rules can prevent someone from their intellectual capital actually being deployed and being recognized. Can I just say one last thing?
Right.
Paul, and then we have to turn to Q&A.
Right.
Paul Fussell has this lovely book on social class, and he makes this point that the stickler for the rules tend to be those that are most status insecure, the lower middle classes, the ones that are constantly surveying those around them.
They're desperately trying to figure out what they're supposed to do.
For social infractions, exactly. And it delights them when they see someone else breaking a rule, because they're like, okay, I'm safe for a moment. And it's the purview of the upper classes, the leisure class, to say, you know what, the rules don't matter, we can all break them, you do you, I do me, because they're content in who they are. And I said, let's all just focus more on, focusing on the rules that actually facilitate human flourishing and conversation, less on the ones that often the rules of etiquette that can divide us.
I once, when I was in college, worked as a server at Paul Fussell's You did? At a party at Paul Fussel's house. Very good tipper. But we'll
That's great.
We'll open it up for questions now.
Yes.
Thanks for doing this. Doesn't your grandma's the Teflon view? Well, I should just say, emotions are motivational tools we evolved to have to respond in ways that promote our survival and mating. And so, doesn't your grandma's view of Teflon, doesn't that, encourage people to be abused and to not stand up to victimization, to just be...
It is a great question. I love that question. Thank you so much. So, in my book, I talk about how civility, it's a social virtue. It's about what we owe the other. It's about the bare minimum of respect that we owe the other by virtue of our shared personhood. But it's also about what we are owed, what we deserve. And that sometimes civility requires us drawing a hard line, telling someone no, respecting someone else enough to have a boundary, respecting ourselves enough to have a boundary in place, and not just doing the polite thing to let ourselves get walked over and sweep a difficult conversation under the rug, but and I think often people do that. We're so inundated with division and toxicity that often in our personal lives we don't want to rock the boat. We just want peace and harmony, and we might just let things go when actually we should take a stand and speak up. And that can be uncomfortable. That can be really difficult to do, but it's a way to respect ourselves, that we deserve better, that we have a boundary, we deserve to be respected. And it's a way to respect others, and to say no and not say yes, and resent someone for being overcommitted, and then resent ourselves for why didn't I, say no when I shouldn't have. So civility is there is a dual obligation there. It's to the other, it's what we owe the other, but it's also what we owe ourselves as well. And yeah.
Can I ask a part B to that?
Yeah.
Okay, so women are higher in agreeableness. They tend to be, that's a pleaser personality trait. So how does that, with that sort of idea, for women to stand up is already, difficult. And a tendency is not a mandate, but it seems to encourage that, so you can say, people should stand up, but how does that, what's the advice of, how do people do these two things at once?
It's a great question. I wrote an article for the Globe and Mail, one of the largest publications in Canada, about the book, and about how I grew up in Canada. That's my tie there. About how Canadians are often...
No wonder you're so nice.
So nice.
I know.
Now, a Canadian friend of mine says it's like a kibbutz run by Presbyterians.
How Canadians are often, they're known as being nice people, right? And that's a badge of national honor and pride. That Americans travel the globe and they wear a Canadian pin on their backpacks. They get treated better. This is a real phenomenon. And I argue that that we can be nice and polite to a fault, actually, and that. But I talk about in this article how growing up in Canada, my grandmother, she was not a wilting violet, nor is my mother, nor am I. And to your point about there being an expectation of agreeableness in women, there were times when I was maligned. I was told I was unreasonable. I was told I was too strong-headed. I couldn't listen to reason because I had thoughts that I verbalized. I don't think I did anything that a man wouldn't do, but there was this stereotype that I think was especially salient in Canadian culture, that there is an expectation of how women should act. And my grandmother definitely wasn't one to just take things lying down. But I think it's a great point.
Anybody else?
We have time for one or two more
Okay,
questions.
and we do have this game too. So, yeah.
When you're reading Paul Fussell and you experience real life, you do see that hospitality is a bimodal distribution where people in the upper and working class seem to be the most hospitable. As you said earlier, the middle class seems to be the most focused on politeness and finding errors in one's behavior and experiences. What could be done to improve the hospitality and civility of the middle class as you define it?
It's a great question. It starts with knowing your neighbor. It starts with making a bid for friendship and affection, and even if it's not reciprocated, not letting that deter you, either with that person or with another person. I think it's easy. Research has found that our human brains interpret social rejection in a way that is tantamount to receiving and interpreting physical pain. And this goes back to our like evolutionary roots that back in history, being expelled from the tribe, being rejected meant like certain death. So we interpret that it's a really grave thing to be rejected. And so it's tempting that, when we make an effort to reach out to someone and that's not reciprocated or turned down, it might really discourage us and make us not want to try, for another 6 months or something like that. And this is another thing that my mother and my grandmother are so excellent at. They keep trying with people. They keep reaching across, and they don't let one person's, brushing them off prevent them from trying again with someone else, someone new. And, they're eccentric and a little kooky, like I love them, but there's no question that they make the world a warmer and more gentle and welcoming place. And so what can we do? That everything that we, our daily actions can have way more power to heal our deep divisions than we realize. Just even if we're not comfortable welcoming someone into our home, like inviting someone to a meal or to coffee, there are ways that we can create community even without the incredible hospitality of Sean and Sasha tonight, like welcome this huge group into their home. So thank you. Where are you guys? Thank you so much for having us. One more? Okay, go ahead.
How do you teach civility, and then after you've taught it, what are the sort of exercises to keep the civility muscle strong?
It's a great question. So in traditional pedagogy, there was learning by instruction, learning by example, and then learning by action, right? And there's orthodoxy, like right belief, cultivating the disposition of civility, then orthopraxy, like living it out. And so I think, when it comes to teaching civility, we all have young people in our lives. Like, how do we embody these values of tolerance, of respect across difference, of patience, of grace, of compassion? I think too often we're content with do as I say and not as I do, but we underappreciate the power that our example has. It's often a more powerful teacher than just what we say. So really owning our responsibility in modeling this virtue and this set of virtues for younger generations. And I love what you said about cultivating the muscle, because it is a muscle. It is something that weakens with practice. Without practice, we saw this during the pandemic, and there's this whole, like, we were not with other people for a very long time. We were we didn't have pants on, we're on Zoom, and now when we're coming together, we're all a little rusty. Like, how do we just coexist in ways that don't repulse and disgust and antagonize one another unnecessarily? Companies are spending tons of money on etiquette experts, like teaching people how to just use a shared kitchen again, when people have been, it is a muscle that has atrophied without use. And this is something I'm thinking a lot about. I'm so grateful to each of you being here tonight. This is a wonderful conversation. I'm honored to have you. I hope you read the book. Hearing me talk, reading the book, that is a one-off intervention. But this is a daily commitment to a type of life, and it's the good life. It's the life in community with others. It's the best life. It's not easy though. It's fraught. It's perilous. It's vexing. And it takes commitment, day in, day out, minute by minute. And I love that analogy of the muscle. We have to exercise it. We have to keep it sharp, keep it strong. And if we fail to, it atrophies, and it takes a toll. It has this negative, vicious cycle ripple effect. We didn't get to talk about the Larry David effect. I wish Larry David was here.
I wanted to ask you about hypocrisy. But there's a lot of things we didn't talk about. But okay, so Lexi was kind enough to let me bring some of my books. But then what are we going to do with them? Because I can't give them all away to every one of you. I don't have that many copies, and I'm just a person. So she suggested that we have a trivia test, a trivia quiz. But the problem with that is the way you would normally do that is you would ask questions about her book, but you're only now getting it, so that's not a problem. So I remembered as I was putting on my makeup, so this was not long for this event, that George Washington had rules of civility and decent behavior. And I didn't remember that there are 100 of them. There's a lot. So what I've done is I have selected some, and then using ChatGPT, I've also got some fake ones. So I'm going to read them, and if you think this is a fake one, raise your hand, and then I will tell you whether it is or not. And the idea is, you know, the people who are the most often right will get books if they want them. This may not work at all. As I said, you know,
How do we let you know if it's fake?
last minute
Yell
thing.
fake? How do we let you know if it's fake? Just yell fake.
No, raise your hand if you think it's fake.
So like polite.
Right. If you think it's fake, raise your hand. And then after that, I will tell you other ones. Okay, so the first one is, every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those who are present. That is a real one. So, another one is, pass not a jest at the expense of another's reputation. Speak ill of no man's dog, nor his horse for amusement. That is a fake one. So
You're winning, Susan.
So those of you who said that was a fake one, chalk up one thing.
It's an honor system.
Yeah, it's an honor system, sorry. Okay, number 3, show nothing to your friend that may affright them. Affright him, I'm sorry. That is actually real. Put not off your clothes in the presence of others, nor go out of your chamber half dressed.
Fake. Oh, sorry.
That is real. Although it speaks to the whole Zoom no pants. I not only wore pants, I wore makeup, which is not normal. Okay. Keep your nails clean and short. Also your hands and teeth clean, yet without showing any great concern for them.
That sounds fake.
That's real.
He didn't have one teeth.
In your number 6, in your attire In your attire, prefer modesty over fashion, and shun garments of excessive brightness or peculiar make, as they distract and unsettle the company. That one is indeed fake. Show not yourself glad at the misfortune of another, though he were your enemy. Yes, that one is real, very to the point. When you see a crime punished, you may be inwardly pleased, but always show pity to the suffering offender. Nope, that's real. When in company, place not your arms across the breast, as it shows disdain or indifference to those present. That one is fake, yes. In visiting the sick, do not presently play the physician if you be not knowing therein. That's real. So how many people got one of the fake ones correct? Okay. How many people got 2 of the fake ones correct?
So if they just said fake every time, right?
Yeah, I know, I didn't do this right. Okay, all right, we do it over. How many got, there's 10 of them. How many got more than 5 correct? One way or the other. Okay. How many people got more than 5 correct?
Raise your hand high.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You can all get free books, whether you want them or not.